Hey, Alysa, good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Hey, I wanted to talk to you today about something that's just been on my mind. It feels a little squishy. It's dark patterns. I'd love to figure out where the line is, how to think about it. So can we start there?
Sure.
Okay, so let me tell you, I think there's levels to this stuff. Firstly, dark patterns, there feels like there's the obvious. In the privacy module, is the button to opt in bigger than the button to opt out, vice versa? Like, is it just easier to hand over your data than not? And that seems to be a pretty clear, okay, that's a dark pattern. They need to be balanced, right?
Yes,
No, good.
so you talk about a button in a privacy module, but I think about multiple interactions you have with a company all the time where you need to provide personal information just within the context of engaging. It can't just be the bigger button because there's always engagement. I think this goes to your squishy point. You really have to take it kind of step by step from a call to action, engagement, setting up an account, and then all of the other kind of data sharing concepts, data collection concepts that come up over the time of the engagement.
Gotcha. So that's, I think, my second question. Like, what if there's no button? It's just how the thing was designed. I'll give you an example, right? The other day, I asked Siri for directions to wherever, and Siri said, I can't do that unless you enable precise location data. I want to be able to talk to Siri in my car, but I feel like you're asking me for too much. And it feels like give me your precise location data, turn that thing on, and you'll get this little thing. And I want it to be able to say, I want to give you precise location data for this use case. And I want to understand if I give it to you, like, what else are you doing with that data? And just that option didn't feel available. And that's inherent in the design. Like, there's no button at all. There's no thing to press. Does that get into dark pattern territory, or is that something else?
Well, I mean, I think we're in a very quick moving trajectory of change because we're coming from a notice and consent, which means so long as you provided notice and if it was material information, you provided that notice in a more prominent way. But so long as the person said, okay, I agree, or I don't opt out, depending on what it is, you were fine. And what we're seeing in a lot of the new laws, Maryland is a really good example, federal APRA, or I think they're calling it ARPA, privacy legislation, have take it from a different paradigm in that you have to have a legitimate business purpose. And depending on the type of data, you cannot, like, consent may not even be an option. And so really thinking about presume nothing. If you do need it, you really need to support what is are we in a strictly necessary category? And so what is the strictly necessary data? Is it reasonably necessary and proportionate? And that is not the way product thinks, right? I mean, because sometimes you don't even know. And it's certainly not the way advertisers and marketers are trained. And it just runs counter to that. So I think we are very much at this tension point of what is enough, and do you present it in a way that's meaningful? Like, where is choice actually really appropriate, and what are the buckets of choice you need to give, while also being sensitive to the critique of there's so many choices, right? Like going to any website, it's just constant choices. You just click, click, click. I think you can never look at privacy in a vacuum. I mean, this is a value exchange. This is an economy. This is to make things work. And to
Mm.
make things work, there are a lot of layers to that reason. Can I give you the particular service you asked for? But you always want that company to innovate and you like the shiny object that's the next version 2.0 that they roll out. Well, if they're only able to collect and use your information for just a narrow lane, then they may not have the data that helps them come up with the version 2. And I think that value proposition, there's a lot of criticism of notice and choice, and having too many
Mhm.
choices sometimes feels like no choice, or too much notice is it's not feasible to read all of that. But you also have, there's a lot of value to data, certain types of data being collected and used for different reasons. And we want guardrails around that. And it is the hot potato. There's a push and pull on where's the right line to draw for that.
It was one of the pieces I liked about ARPA. Is that what they're calling it? Well, I liked that. I felt like it reduces the cognitive load on consumers when you push some of the obligations towards business. And what I mean by that is you're pushing obligations to brands that are dealing with data and have been doing it for decades. So they should be able to understand what data minimization should look like, and to manage what you were just describing. Hey, we need this for this, but we're trying to get out of version 2, and there's some data we need to collect there as well, which is all like reasonable stuff.
Well, we're changing the paradigm. I mean, you put the burden on one or the other. I think that there's going to be responsibilities, and there's definitely going to be growing pains to get there, because it just hasn't been an infrastructure that companies had to design like at the core. And there's some critique about that. But there's a lot of pains as we figure out where the landing spot is. I think the fact that it is such a moving target is also hard, because companies are building things to respond to what they know exists today from legal frameworks, but we keep dangling, might be this framework, it might be that. And so it's really hard to build something consistent that has a long-term vision to that.
Why do you think they put it in the dark patterns provision in NAPA?
Well, I think we've had consumer protection laws for a really long time, and this unfair and deceptive trade practices, that's the basic prong, right? It's either you're making a material misrepresentation that's important to that consumer's action, their consumer decision, or you're doing something unfair, which has a very detailed definition, but essentially consumer can't avoid it. There's a cost benefit analysis, and the benefits are not enough either for competition or for the consumer. And so we've had that, but it requires judgment. It requires some subjectivity to each new scenario. And the critique is like the way that businesses are interpreting that gives too much leeway in the execution. It's a little bit all over the map. And so I think dark patterns tries to put a finer point on it, and really thinking about the user interface and teeing up in the privacy context, user decision making, making sure that we're not putting all of the eggs in one basket. So it's really the only choice is the one that requires them to give more data away, right? Like you have to go through so many more clicks, so many more steps. You have to have really good vision to read this tiny small print, and like that doesn't work. And so underlined, bolded, italicized to make this point.
I love that, actually. I love it a lot. The whole like, hey, there's really only one thing you can do. If you follow that down, that might be the dark pattern. That's a great way to think about it. Hey, change topics real quick. Your post about Vermont and the private right of action. I mean, you told me about this months ago, maybe a year ago, how like much of a poison pill that kind of stuff can be in legislation. Like, what's going on there?
Well, it is and it isn't, depending on really that state. And I think that's what we're finding. Washington, that was not a poison pill, and at least specific with health information, that was enough to get groundswell agreement to counter critiques of that. In Maine, not enough. Big constituency there. That was just too much. And at least what we're seeing, there's still a little bit left of the legislative session in Vermont, but that really was enough to not pull enough support for that, at least as of this time, based on the local coverage.
It's interesting, not to be like too controversial here, but I love Vermont, and I thought the Venn diagram of tree huggers and private right of action supporters would be almost 100%, but it turns out it might not be.
Well, Vermont's an interesting state. I mean, there is a lot of independence to that state. We've seen it just from a consumer protection history. They can be very very affirmative enforcement of consumer protection on some things, and other things that's not their jam, and they step back. So I think it really is, this is the patchwork where each state, sometimes they're following a model, and sometimes, like your Maryland's, they're doing it differently.
Gotcha. Well, thanks, Lisa. I appreciate it. We've got into a couple pretty cool topics. Have a
Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. Bye.